Zags added a bye game to the non-conference slate, and an old friend might be back on the schedule in 25-26 after taking this year off.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Tuesday. Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you all by FanDuel. Folks, as the playoffs wind down, the sports aren't happening as much as we would like them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus every single day. That's right. There's something for everybody every day, all summer long. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. Well, it is an update on the Zags set to participate in the Olympics. We got a few more names to toss out there. It's going to be a very Zag-centric Olympic Games in 2024 in Paris. We're going to talk about that. Plus, the slow death of MTEs continues as Baylor departs the 2025 Maui Invitational. Bad news for Maui, bad news for MTEs, not bad news for Gonzaga, who may end up facing Baylor or Iowa State, as they are both set to join that Players Era NIL tournament in 2025. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the Olympics, but first, there's a new game on Gonzaga's schedule, officially, or not officially, I should say, but reportedly from Rocco Miller. Fantastic follow on Twitter if you don't follow him. Fantastic information on scheduling. Talks a lot about West Coast mid-major basketball as well. He reported that there is a game set to take place between Gonzaga and Nicholls State on December 18th at the McCarthy Athletic Center. This is one of Gonzaga's bye games for the upcoming season. Every year, Gonzaga has a handful of very marquee non-conference opponents. Think your home and homes with Alabama, your Kentuckys, your UConns, your UCLAs, et cetera, et cetera. They also have a couple of usually mid-tier games. Washington ends up in that mid-tier. We'll talk about Washington very momentarily. And then they have the bye games. Usually those are opponents like Texas Southern or Jackson State or Mississippi Valley State in the SWAC, or regional opponents like Idaho, Eastern Washington, Montana, etc. Those are the bye games, as in Gonzaga pays money to bring that school onto campus so that they can lose a game on the road. That is effectively what a bye game is. And this is the first one known for Gonzaga's schedule. There will probably be at least 4 of these, maybe 5. In the past couple of years, Gonzaga has traditionally played 5 of these bye game type contests. They have a slightly more limited non-conference schedule this year because of the additions of Oregon State and Washington State into the WCC. So whether that means they will cut marquee games or whether they will cut bye games from the non-conference slate kind of remains to be seen. It seems like based on, they already have San Diego State, they already have UCLA, they already have Kentucky, they already have UConn. They also already have the 3 games in the Maui Invitational. That means 7 of their non-conference games are already spoken for, and they're all pretty darn good opponents. So we'll probably see at least one more marquee or at least very quality opponent added to the schedule. But folks, there's only 5 games left. Don't be surprised if most of the rest of Gonzaga's opponents that are going to be scheduled for this upcoming season are going to be of that ilk. They're going to be the regional, not very good mid-major teams, or they're going to be the bye games from the SWAC conference or something along those lines, including, of course, this game scheduled for December 18th, 4 days after Gonzaga is in New York playing the UConn Huskies at Madison Square Garden. That is a huge monster game that's taking place on December 14th. 4 days after that, Gonzaga will return home. This may be the last game they play before Christmas, although that's a full week. They may end up having one more game between then and the mini Christmas break that Mark Few and the staff typically give the Gonzaga players. They usually have 4 or 5 days off, like between the 22nd and 27th, somewhere in there. This will be one of those last games that they play prior to that. They'll probably have one more marquee non-conference game before the start of conference play. I'm guessing that'll be San Diego State, although we don't have dates finalized for any of those games yet. Nicholls State, they're in the Southland Conference, the same conference that produced McNeese State last year. McNeese was a 30-win team, really successful season under Will Wade, dominated the Southland Conference. McNeese went 17-1 last year, and then Gonzaga obliterated them in the first round of the NCAA tournament. So that maybe gives you a little indication of where this team is at. Now, they finished third. Nicholls State finished third in the Southland last year. They went 20-14 overall. They went 13-5 in conference play. So they were a good team in the Southland Conference. They also returned 3 of their 4 leading scorers. That doesn't happen very often at the mid-major level. So shout out to Nicholls State, shout out to the Colonels for being able to keep 3 of their 4 leading scorers. Their top scorer did transfer. I think he went to UT Arlington, if I remember correctly. They added some quality pieces in the transfer portal as well. They got a transfer from Utah Tech, Jalen Suggs, who's actually from Seattle area. He averaged 10 points and 5 rebounds last year at Utah Tech. They also added a transfer from McNeese, from the rival school there in the conference, Trey English. He didn't play last year with an injury, but a quality piece coming into this Colonels program for Nicholls State. But ultimately, this is not a game that's expected to be particularly competitive. It's not a game where we're going to do, probably not going to do huge recaps of the team or anything like that. It's a tune-up game. It's a game to kind of come off of that performance against UConn, maybe fix things that they didn't like that happened in that game against UConn, get some of the younger guys some playing time and get them to stretch their legs a little bit, because I don't think we're going to see some of those younger non-rotation pieces play a whole lot against UConn, but they'll get an opportunity to play in this game, get themselves some game action before they go into the winter break. So that's the main gist for this Nicholls State game. Obviously, as we get closer to it, we'll have a better sense of what the team looks like and talk about it more then. But expect to see a few more announcements like this in the coming weeks as we get the rest of Gonzaga's schedule finalized. One team that's not going to be on that schedule is the Washington Huskies. We already knew that. We talked about that last week. UW has used the opt-out in the contract. This contract with UW and Gonzaga is supposed to run through 2026, but there was an opt-out in the contract if there was a coaching change. UW made a coaching change, replaced Mike Hopkins with Danny Sprinkle, and they have exercised the option to not play the non-conference game this upcoming season. However, speaking to John Rothstein on his podcast, Danny Sprinkle did indicate that he wants to bring this game back in the 2025-26 season. Which, I mean, sure, we'll take that with a bit of a grain of salt until it actually gets scheduled, until it gets put on the calendar. We'll just have to see if it's actually going to end up happening. Obviously, with this team getting a new coach, a very new roster, a lot of the guys it was going to be a new roster almost regardless, because the ton of the guys that were on that team last year were fifth-year seniors like Moses Wood and Paul Mulcahy and Severe Wheeler and Keon Brooks. So they were going to replace those guys anyway. They've had a successful offseason in the transfer portal. They, as of July 1st, as of yesterday, for when most of you are listening to this, they are officially members of the Big Ten Conference. That is finalized as of July 1st. So with an expanded conference regular season, with a brand new roster, I guess I can see why they might opt out of this game and decide, hey, we're not going to play it this year. We'll come back to it at another time. But, you know, it's still kind of one of those things where you just roll your eyes a little bit of like, okay, yeah, we want to bring it back next year, but we're not going to do it this year. Like, okay, we'll be here. If you want to play it, great. If you don't want to play it, we'll survive. Like, I think we can move on without the UW game if it's not there. Love the rivalry, love the competition. UW obviously won it last year. They have every right to continue to brag about that, but choosing not to play the game this year, doesn't look great. But you know what? We'll see. Gonzaga will fill that game with something else. And if Danny Sprinkle and that squad want to play him again in 25-26, Mark Few's going to pick up the phone and he's going to say yes. And they're going to get that game on the calendar. Hopefully they don't let them skip the game in Spokane, because that's where it's supposed to be this year. So they better be having that game in Spokane if they do end up putting it on the schedule for next season. Well, Baylor left the 2025 Maui Invitational. They're going to join the Players Era NIL tournament. We're going to talk about what that means for Gonzaga and what it means for MTEs as they are continuing to suffer blow after blow. More on that coming up in just a second. Right after I tell you about today's sponsor, FanDuel. Folk, the NBA season, the NHL season, they're done. The drafts are done. They are full on in free agency, but baseball's still in full swing. The WNBA is still kicking. The Olympics are coming up, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. So bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all in an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. And folks, if you're looking ahead to the 2025 NCAA tournament, odds to be the national champion, the Gonzaga Bulldogs plus 2,000 right now. Their odds were much worse a few months ago. They went all the way down to plus 1,800. Now they're at plus 2,000. It is the best time to capitalize. Get that money down. Get that opportunity to win that money if and when the Zags cut down those nets in early April. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to make your first bet an automatic W. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. We're still talking scheduling to an extent here on Locked On Zags. We're talking a little bit more about the future for Gonzaga scheduling and again, having the conversation. For those of you who are everyday listeners, first of all, thank you. I appreciate all of you who check out the show, whether it's once a month, 4 times a month, 15, 18, 20 times a month, whatever it is, sincerely appreciated. But if you are an everyday listener, we have had multiple conversations on the podcast about what seems to be very rapid death of traditional MTEs or multi-team events. Maui Invitational, ESPN Events Invitational, formerly the Old Spice Classic, the Battle for Atlantis, which is, of course, where Gonzaga is going to be this upcoming season. There are tons of other ones, smaller ones. Gonzaga's traditionally kind of cycled between those, but these events are being threatened dramatically by 2 things. One, the Players Era NIL Festival. We'll talk about that. We've talked about it already. It's what Gonzaga is going to participate in starting in the 25-26 season. It is a new MTE that promises $1 million payouts for every team that participates in NIL money. That is the biggest thing that is impacting these current MTEs. The other thing is that with bloated conferences, with the Big Ten adding so many teams, the Big 12 is getting bigger, the SEC is getting bigger. With that continuing to happen, we're seeing the premier basketball programs not wanting to commit to events that cost them 3 non-conference games. So we're probably going to see MTEs become 8-team events with just 2 games over 2 days. We may also see MTEs finding out that they have to find a way to ensure that the players participating in the event are getting compensated in order to survive, because teams are leaving these major events left and right. Used to be you would do anything to get into Maui or to get into Old Spice or to get into the Atlantis tournament. You wanted to be there. It was a marquee event. You got to travel to a fun destination. You got to play really good teams. You got guaranteed TV spots. You knew the college basketball world was going to be watching. That's no longer the case. And it has been a rapid dissension. So Baylor's the next team. They're out in 2025. Not only are they leaving the Maui Invitational, which leaves them at 7 teams for that event in 25, they are also joining the Players Era Invitational Tournament. Iowa State, who was not previously committed to an MTE, is also set to join the Players Era Festival in the 25 season. So not this upcoming year. It is happening this upcoming year. It'll be the first year of the event in Vegas this season. Gonzaga will not be in it. They are, of course, going to be in the Battle for Atlantis. We've talked about that. Creighton, who was supposed to be in the Battle for Atlantis, was one of the first teams to defect from a previously committed MTE to join the Players Era Festival. Creighton said, we're out. We're not doing Atlantis. We're going to go join the Players Era Tournament for 2024. That is why Providence has replaced Creighton in the Battle for Atlantis for this upcoming season. With Baylor and Iowa State joining in the 25-26 season, what will be a 2025 event over Feast Week, 14 of the 18 spots in this tournament are already set. They are shooting for 18 teams. They want it to be 3 pods of 6 teams. That is the goal for how they want this event to shake out. Here are the 14 teams. You obviously have Baylor, Iowa State, and Gonzaga. We know those. Here are the other teams that are in this event for 2025. Alabama, Creighton, Houston, Michigan, Notre Dame, Rutgers, San Diego State, St. John's, St. Joe's, Syracuse, Texas A&M. It is a stacked field. That's 14 out of 18. There's 4 more spots. Considering the recent teams that have signed on to this event, I think it is reasonable to expect that they will continue to get high-profile programs. We've heard the big rumors. We've heard Duke rumored. We've heard Kansas rumored. We've heard Kentucky rumored. My guess is they did talk to those teams, and the fact that Baylor and Iowa State are the teams that have joined probably means they've moved on from talking to those teams. Doesn't mean they're guaranteed not to join. Obviously, you never know. Things could change. But I would expect to see these 4 spots filled by pretty marquee programs. Because what team doesn't want to join an event where you get to compete against the best teams in college basketball, and no matter how you do, your players get $1 million in NIL money divided up amongst them? I've said this on the show again, and the article that Matt Norlander wrote at CBS a while back when this tournament was kind of first coming to fruition was that he had quotes from anonymous coaches who said, I would play in the Mandalay Bay parking lot if it got my team $1 million. And that quote has really stood out to me in this conversation because why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? Even if you're a team that has money, if your program can back up the Brinks truck, the way that like Louisville has seeming endless amounts of money this offseason with Pat Kelsey. We know that Mark Pope had a big bag of money that he could throw around at Kentucky. We obviously know Arkansas has money. We know that the big, huge programs like Texas and Alabama and they all have money to throw around as well. But why not get more? And it's guaranteed money. You can tell your players, hey, this is what we're offering you, but you also are going to get a percentage of the money from this tournament. And most teams are signing up to this event for 3 years, 3-year contracts. At this time, we don't know if Gonzaga is like committed to doing this for 3 straight seasons, but they're committed for at least 1 year, and a lot of the other teams are committed for multiple years. If you're a freshman or a 1-year transfer, and if you're looking at these big time programs, if you're looking at any of the programs on this list, basically, maybe outside of a few, you're probably looking to get some decent money from your NIL deal as it is. But if they can also say, hey, if you're here for 3 years, every single year we're going to be in this event, and our team's going to make $1 million, and if we win it, we'll make $2 million, and you will get a cut of that, guaranteed money. Like that's just a huge recruiting tool that you have over other programs that cannot make that offer. And if you're in this tournament and another team is not, and you're offering similar amounts of money, that gives you an edge. The smallest edge in recruiting is all these coaches are angling for is a slight advantage, something they can do to help them land the best recruit, the best transfer, whatever it may be. Any advantage that you can get, you're going to take. And yes, I think these coaches like going to Maui and they like going to the Battle for Atlantis. And I don't think that they want to get out of these events. And I think a lot of them would probably rather go to those places than Vegas in November. But at the same time, you got to go where the money is. And that's what these programs are going to do. And as I've said on this podcast before, the other MTEs, Maui, Atlantis, etc., they have to adapt. Whether that's ratcheting down the number of games, instead of having 8 teams there, you have 4 teams there. Maybe you find ways to get money, or you find a way to get a donor or a sponsor who's willing to put out money that can be paid out to those teams, to those players in NIL. I think you have to do one of those 2 things. And frankly, you probably have to do both. It feels insane that we're watching events that have been a staple of college basketball for decades. We are watching them circle the drain in an incredibly rapid fashion. And I don't feel like I'm being hyperbolic when I say that. Some of you may think that I am, and you've heard me talk about this a few times. But the reason I keep bringing it up is because things keep happening that are signaling that these events are on their deathbed. You lose Creighton for this upcoming season. Creighton pulls out less than a year, barely 6 months before the event starts. That doesn't happen very often. And then you have big time programs pulling out of future events. Gonzaga is probably going to do this for a couple of years. In that case, they won't be in Maui. They won't be in Atlantis. They won't be in those other events for a couple of seasons. That is the reality, is that those events, they may not be long for this world. And if they do stick around, they will either be populated by mid-major programs as opposed to the elite college basketball programs, which is fine. I'm still going to watch the Maui Invitational if it's a handful of good WCC and Mountain West and A10 teams. If that's who they get, great. I'm still watching it. But is the general college basketball population? Probably not. Not if it's going on at the same time as a tournament in Vegas that has all 5 blue bloods and a bunch of other great teams because they're all getting paid money. That's going to draw the attention away from that. So it'll be interesting to see what happens here. I don't think we're being overdramatic by saying that these events may not even exist a couple years from now, or at least would look dramatically different if they do. It is a changing tide in college athletics. We're recording this on July 1st, the first day of Oregon and Washington and USC and UCLA being in the Big 10, of the 4 corner schools being in the Big 12, of Stanford and Cal, our ACC members, as I'm talking to you right now. If we can't wrap our head around the fact that something might happen to our beloved MTEs, like we're having to wrap our head around Stanford being in the ACC. Like to be unwilling to believe that something like that might happen just doesn't feel right, because so many crazy things have already happened in college athletics in just the last calendar year. And I fear that these events, again, events that have been so popular and so kind of glorified in college basketball, may not be long for this world. But we're going to transition away to that and talk about the Olympics, because Jalen Suggs, Rui Hachimura, and Angel Nunez join the growing list of former Gonzaga basketball players set to participate in the 2024 Olympic Games. More coming up on that in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we are talking Olympic basketball. And folks, I'm going to tell you right now, if you are a dedicated, regular, everyday listener and you're going to be sticking with us from now until the start of the college basketball season in November, you're going to hear a lot about the Olympics, because that is the big storyline this summer as we get into the slowest months. Gonzaga's roster is set. There's no more changes there. There's going to be a few more scheduling updates, but by and large, there's not a lot of news that's going to happen in the Gonzaga landscape over the next couple of months. The news that does happen going to be related to the Olympics. There are so many former Zags set to participate, or hoping to participate, or potentially going to participate in the Olympic Games in Paris this summer. We've talked about quite a few of them already. We're going to talk about a few more today, starting with Jalen Suggs. I know that you're checking out, if you're on YouTube, you're checking out that I threw on a new jersey, Rui Hachimura jersey. We're going to talk about him in a second, but we're going to start with Suggs, because Suggs was picked for the USA Select team. And what this is, it's a roster of 15 players who are basically practice squad players against the men's national team. So the team that Mark Few's coaching, the team with LeBron James and Steph Curry and Jason Tatum and Bam Adebayo and Anthony Davis and Tyrese Halliburton and Anthony Edwards and et cetera, that roster needs a team to compete against, to get practice in, to get game ready, to kind of prepare against the opponent they're going to face. And that team is comprised of 15 players, including former Gonzaga guard and Orlando Magic guard Jalen Suggs. The players selected for the select team often end up representing the United States on the national team in the future. In fact, both Tyrese Halliburton and Anthony Edwards were on the select team a couple of years ago before the Olympics in Japan. They are now on the men's national team as well. So this is a promising sign that Jalen Suggs is somebody that is being identified as a potential future Olympian to represent the United States in the Olympics. That is what this means. And that is a tremendous accomplishment for Suggs on its own. Even, he's not there yet, but that's still an amazing accomplishment to be in that conversation at this point. He's a former Zag competing against Mark Few. Mark Few talked about the uniqueness of coaching against his former players, like when they play Canada and Kelly Olynyk's there and Andrew Nembhard's there, and just how unique that is. And now, even in practices in Las Vegas, when they have their practice, their training camp, he's going to be going up against former players in Jalen Suggs, at least in that event. Lots of other great players on this roster. Cooper Flagg is kind of the big headliner. He hasn't even played a single second of college basketball. He's a commit to Duke, the top player in the class, the almost certainly 2025 first overall pick in the NBA draft. Cooper Flagg is on this roster. Some familiar faces to Gonzaga fans: Jaime Jaquez from UCLA, had a great rookie season with the Heat. Brandon Pajemski from Santa Clara, who was with the Golden State Warriors. Brandon Miller from Alabama. Peyton Pritchard from Oregon. Some NBA veterans: Trey Murphy, Keegan Murray's on the roster. Jabari Smith from the Houston Rockets and from Auburn. Jalen Duren from Memphis. Lots of really talented players on this roster. And Jalen Suggs is going to get an opportunity to compete with them, to compete against the national team. Just a cool and exciting opportunity for him. Got to talk Rui as well. Rui Hachimura. It sounds like he is going to represent Japan at the Olympics. There was some question of whether he would. He obviously represented Japan at the last Olympics in Japan, which was an incredible opportunity for him. He was fantastic. He was the best player on that team, but Japan didn't do very well. And frankly, they weren't really expected to do all that well. But Rui took the team not doing very well, especially in his home country, really hard. And it led to some mental health issues. It led to him missing a large chunk of a season with the Washington Wizards. He has since found himself, got back on the floor, is now with the Los Angeles Lakers, had the best season of his professional career last year. So he seems to be in a better space. But there was still questioning whether he would kind of put himself through that again. And it does sound like, yes, he is willing to play with Team Japan in the Olympics. So another former Zag who's going to represent his country in the Olympic Games. The other one, I mentioned him in the teaser there, and some of you might be like, I'm not even sure I know who that is. Angel Nunez. Played at Gonzaga from 2013 to 2015. He was on the team for 2 years. He had redshirted the year previously, so he was at Gonzaga for 3 years. He is going to be on the roster for the Dominican Republic as they attempt to compete to get one of the final qualifying spots to be at the Olympics. So the DR's got to make it for Nunez to be an Olympian. They got to make it. But if they do, he will be on that roster. The only other name, frankly, that I recognize on the roster is Chris Duarte, who is an NBA player from Oregon. He played with the Pacers. He played with the Kings. I believe he was with the Kings last year. But other than that, it was a lot of guys that names were not familiar to me. But Nunez played at Gonzaga for 2 seasons, like I said, played 24 games his first year with the Zags, 3.5 points, 2 boards. The next year, he played 28 games, started one of them, about 6.5 minutes per game, about 3 points, about 2 boards. So he was a role player. Didn't have a significant role at Gonzaga in the 2 years that he was there. He actually started his career at Louisville, played 12 games with the Cardinal before transferring, sitting out a year, playing 2 years at Gonzaga, finished his career at South Florida. 3 schools in 5 years. Commonplace now, was not common 10 years ago. It's unique to see Angel Nunez do that, but he transfers to South Florida for his final year of eligibility, was fantastic there, about 10.6 boards a game, has had a lucrative and lengthy professional basketball career over the last decade. He's played in France, he's played in the Dominican Republic, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Greece, and Poland in his professional career. Now he might have the opportunity to represent his country in the Olympics this summer in Paris. I'm polling for the DR and polling for Nunez to get that opportunity, so we have another Zag on that list. Here's the list. Let's talk about the list. Right now, who I know, and I'm hoping I'm not missing anybody. Please let me know if I am. But right now, this is who I have set to participate in the Olympic Games, assuming their countries all qualify. For the USA, of course, we have Mark Few as an assistant coach for Team USA. You also have Jalen Suggs, who is on that select team. He's not obviously going to be, he's not going to win a medal. He's not going to be an Olympian, but he is part of the process of helping that team get ready for the Olympic Games. For Canada, you have Kelly Olynyk, the team captain for Team Canada, the vocal leader, the leader for that program for Canada basketball, kind of the face of them right now. And then you have Andrew Nembhard, who's going to represent them as well. Really great guard group for Team Canada. They have Shai Gilgeous-Alexander coming off a fantastic season for Oklahoma City. Jamal Murray is on that team from the Denver Nuggets as well. A handful of other fantastic players. Lou Dort is on the team. Like there's a lot of great players on that squad, and Andrew Nembhard is among them. You also have Yvonne Ejim, who will represent Canada on the women's side, current Gonzaga player. Not very many of those who are on this list, but she's obviously, we saw what she was able to accomplish last year. Really, really talented player. I'm very excited to see her career blossom, not just professionally like in the WNBA, but also internationally as a member of Team Canada. You also have Filip Petrusev, who will play for Serbia alongside some guy named Nikola Jokic. You have, we already mentioned Nunez for the Dominican Republic. You have Domantas Sabonis set to represent Lithuania. I think Lithuania still needs to qualify. They are a traditionally very good basketball country. They're a small country, though, so they still have to make sure they can find their way in. But Sabonis, obviously, one of the most talented players in the entire world in basketball. So if he was on that team, he would certainly give whatever teams they end up facing some fits for Lithuania. And then, of course, Rui, as we just mentioned, has confirmed his participation with Japan. Looking at other rosters, don't see Joel Ayayi or Killian Tilly for France. Would have been fun to see those guys on the roster. That's a very deep, very talented roster. There's some St. Mary's guys for Australia, which is, I guess cool for them. But nobody from Gonzaga representing Australia. Germany, there's a couple of potential options, some former German players, but none of them who made that roster or at this point, at least. So we'll continue to track this. We'll continue to see if there are other Gonzaga players who end up participating in the Olympics this season. But what a list already. And that's why I'm so excited to get a chance to cover this, because there's multiple different games where we will get to look at how a Gonzaga player did while representing their country in the Olympics. And that's a really cool part of Gonzaga basketball and their international recruiting that they do, and just gives us an opportunity to really celebrate that on a national stage, on an international stage, I should say, during the offseason. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you so much To those of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day, we'll be back on Wednesday getting you ready for the 2 new teams joining the West Coast Conference this year officially. We'll talk about that. We'll keep you up to date as Summer League gets started as well. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, as always, go Zags.